all these entrepreneurs will have this secret sauce. They'll have something that's really special, and they don't brand it.
Mm.
I mean, if you can brand radical honesty and radical hospitality, you can brand anything.
True.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change? I'm Jessic and Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and, well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode.
Today we have David Aaker as our guest, and David is a professor emeritus at Berkeley, School of Business at Berkeley, and David's written a whole slew of books, and David is also known as the father of brand marketing. So, Dad, we're really glad to have you here today. We were just talking about, like, the things people call us. So, first of all, tell us how you became the beloved father of brand marketing.
Yes, I want to know this story.
Jessica wants to know the dirt. So give us some dirt first.
Well, it turns out there's no organization that certifies things like that. And it's very awkward to nominate yourself.
Uh-huh.
But what happened was a friend, Phil Kotler, who was probably the only one with the stature to nominate titles on people. He was reviewing one of my books. He's reviewed all my books, I think. But one of them he reviewed, Aaker on branding. And in making the review, he called me the father of branding. And so we put it on the cover. And now people use that label, but they have no idea why they should.
Well, you know what? When I read it, I was thinking like Mad Men, John Hamm, kind of like the end-all be-all of branding guy.
Yeah.
Did you watch Mad Men?
Well, I watched a little bit of it a long time ago, but no, I haven't watched much of it.
Well, you should because you kind of could relate to him.
I had the basic idea.
Yeah.
And there's some truth in that, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s and how ad agencies worked. The sort of illustrative of their philosophy is that if you have nothing to say, sing it. And that was sort of what they did.
What a time, huh, for thinking about branding. I mean, Jessica and I both recall the moment of Netflix and chill. And I forget that was somebody just on the internet.
Yeah.
I don't think that was a strategy, right? We didn't make it up, but it was so on point, right? It was like a viral branding that became part of the brand. And so tell me what you're seeing now. Tell me about the recent book about purpose, because we sure hear a lot about that from our audience and our constituents.
Well, I told you early on that I thought we had a lot in common because usually the most important audience for a brand vision is the employees and the partners of the organization that are putting things out. So it's really important to identify, 3, 4, 5 things that you really stand for. And then when you do that right and you get the right labels and everything, it just can change everything for people in the organization. The Hall School of Business completely transformed itself maybe 10, 12 years ago when Rich Lyons was the dean. He and asked me to help him, but he developed this brand vision. It turned out to be confidence without attitude. Students always beyond yourself, question the status quo, but confidence without attitude was a huge differentiator. And business schools around the world were so envious because they had a whole set of student body and faculty that had an attitude.
Yeah, no kidding.
And Berkeley really doesn't. And it changed everything at Berkeley. It changed the way you admit students. Students have to write an essay and say, tell us how you correspond to these 4 principles.
Uh-huh.
And they selected faculty. They developed courses. They developed programs. It affected their recruiting. And at that time, and I think it's still true, every single business school stood for 4 things. They're global, they're entrepreneur, they're social, and they're leaders.
Mm-hmm.
At every single business school, that's what they're doing. And so here you have a business school that talks about innovation in a different way. It's challenge the status quo. That's a little different. We're just going to teach innovation, but confidence without attitude was just an enormous thing. And so you go and say, what's different about cause to somebody there, whether it's a student or faculty, wherever, bang,
Mm-hmm.
confidence without attitude, challenge the status quo, and then beyond yourself. Everybody else is talking about social program, but they got a rich tradition in being a social pioneer. And anyway, we were just working with a nonprofit recently, and they were formed to help people stay in homes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they give them rides and help with the plumbing and whatever it takes. Well, it turns out that 90% of the candidates for this thing think they're not ready for that yet. But anyway, the thing involved is, so now it's all about making connections or fostering connections so that you have a social support. It's about healthy aging, then it's about valuing service. So now it's a community.
Right.
And what makes the community are these principles that drive the culture. It's what people do, it's the norms of behavior, and so on. And just as an aside, Netflix is now famous, thanks to YouTube, with their 3 pillars of the culture. But one of them is radical honesty. And another nonprofit I worked with branded the style of interacting with their clients and customers. And who would do that? I mean, nobody brands an operating style, but it was called radical hospitality. So they're treating their clients as friends. They ask them about their background, their aspirations, their challenges. They don't just say, here's a shower. They delivered shower to the homeless
Right.
and other things like for the homeless. But when I saw radical honesty, I thought, maybe they stole it from this nonprofit.
Well, in my book, I talk about radical honesty, and in reflection, I sometimes wish I hadn't called it that, because it shouldn't be radical, to be honest. I really just mean being straight, being honest. But now that you say that, what a clever thing to think of, huh?
Yeah.
Because it's not normal for most people.
Well, my experience is that putting the label on these pillars or principles or whatever you call them, the label is so crucial.
Mm.
And I'm not a believer in rules or something, especially when it comes to creating copy. It has to be what it needs to be. And one of my theories about branding is that you don't have any preconceived dimensions. It's whatever dimensions work for you.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I'm pretty sure is that one word doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be global, if you want to be entrepreneur, if you want to be honest, if you want to have confidence, you've got to say what your take on that is.
Ah.
And so if you just said honesty, that's a pretty bland statement. There's no energy. There's no way to own that. It's sort of the table stakes. Everybody has to be honest.
Yeah.
But when you say radical honesty, then you have permission to find some kind of honesty that is different.
Well, maybe you should change your mind on that, Patty. I don't know.
He's talked me out of it. My lips are sealed on that one.
As you were talking, David, I was thinking, what's the difference between a value and a brand? Because, as you were talking about the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, that's a value that they're trying to live, right? But it's also branding. So is there a difference?
A couple of things. First of all, I don't worry a lot about labels. I use pillars and I used to use elements, and some people use principles, some people use values, some people use dimensions, and I don't really care. But the other thing, I never talk about brand. I mean, except for the fact that a brand defines who made the stuff or who provided the service. So if you want to know who did it, then you look at the brand name. That's who did it. So I never talk about brand. I talk about brand equity. And so I've defined brand equity, and I expect people to manage the organization to develop and maintain a healthy brand equity that will enable their strategy to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So my first book on branding was defining brand equity and why it drives success.
Do you think that the word is kind of overused? Because I'm thinking, there's the brand of the company. Then there's employer branding was the big Remember that was the trend for a couple of years. And then there was personal branding. So is that partly why you don't use the word? You just think it's washed out and doesn't really mean anything anymore?
Oh, no, I shouldn't say I don't use the word. What I meant to say is that what I do is talk about brand equity and I talk about brand vision,
Mm-hmm.
which is an important part of brand equity. And I talk about brand loyalty and I talk about brand relevance. So those constructs, I've written a book on most of them,
Mm-hmm.
but I just don't talk about the word brand by
Yeah.
itself.
Which makes perfect sense. When I think back about my Netflix days and the amount of effort that we all put into brand, and there was this sort of constant tension between the effort versus the ROI, right? I think that there's a lot of CEOs who really believe that your brand can impact things significantly. And then there's those that need more convincing. And so, how much weight does a CEO play, or the leader, whoever's leading, play in the brand and the success of the company or its ability to come to life in the fullest way?
Well, when brand equity came on the scene, which was in the late 1980s, 30, 35 years ago, it really changed everything. Before that, you had the P&G brand management system. Brand was all about advertising. It was delegated to middle managers and they delegated to ad agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very tactical.
Mm-hmm.
And when you develop brand equity, and my definition of brand equity said that it's beyond awareness and image, it involves brand loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
And that changes everything because now everybody has to be involved in the brand because it's all about how you design the product or service and how you deliver the product or service and how you interact with customers. What's the customer experience like? So when you bring loyalty into the picture, you can't delegate it to an agency anymore.
Right. It's not a tagline anymore.
It's more than a tagline, yeah. And
Yeah.
so anyway, it was no longer middle management. Suddenly we had chief marketing officers, we had vice president of marketing. Suddenly they were at the executive table. They were in the C-suite,
Mm-hmm.
and they were dealing with strategy. They were bringing to the table customer insight and so on, and segmentation. And so that really changed everything. With it came a view that advertising is more than tactical. And coupled with that was, you remember scanner data that came into the world in the mid 80s, and people thought, oh, we can now manage marketing scientifically, just like we manage everything else. It's no longer a black box
Mm-hmm.
because you do these experiments, you find out what advertising works, how many exposures, and you can maximize everything. So they did that. And they used the scanner data to monitor people's television watching and what they bought. And they learned that price off is the only thing that worked.
Mm.
Only thing. So everybody went to these price off programs and they did three things. One, they taught customer price is the only thing that's important.
Mm-hmm.
They also taught them if it's not on sale now, wait a week or two, it will be.
Mm-hmm.
And third, they destroyed brands.
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of realized this isn't working. And so they try to build their brands back. It took years. But anyway, that was part of the shift. That's part of one of the drivers why brand equity came into the fore.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's kind of where we were. And so what's happened over 30 years, gradually the idea that brands are an asset and require investment and they enable business success in the long run, and they're not there just to pop sales next week. Well, it turns out that we declared victory a little early.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that there's sort of bubbling up every once in a while all over the place. This thing is, let's look at the ROI. Let's look at the sales generated by advertising.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to cut back investment. We sort of can't afford all this shit. So where are we going to cut back? Well, let's cut back strategic advertising because that won't change anything in the short run. And so it turns out the battle is not over yet.
Mm-hmm.
The battle's ongoing.
Yeah, and so I'm guessing the CEO plays a crucial role in that decision with budgeting and so forth. And so have you seen companies succeed through this and really find that happy place where, they're not necessarily worried about the dollars? We're always worried about the dollars, but that they're being well spent and this isn't the first place you go to cut right? It's always marketing.
I don't know. I just read this article literally like last week about AI and the disruption of internet advertising, right? And that finally people are really looking at that data, and it turns out that it just doesn't really move the needle that much, right? A pop-up ad and all that personalization that we were going to get to really move the brands forward through the internet was like, yeah, well, it turns out that it doesn't really drive. So if it doesn't drive sales, to Jessica's point, however you think about that, is the emotional part as important as the dollars and cents?
Yeah, the emotional part of the brand. Like, it's hard to put a dollar cost on that, but it's really important how people feel about you. I mean, Patty and I know this from working at Netflix. If you wore any Netflix gear at an airport or at the mall or whatever, there would be subscribers coming up and telling us whether they loved the service or hated the service and why. And so I just never wore anything Netflix outside of my house.
What my story is, I'm in line at the San Jose airport going through security. This is really, really, really early on, DVD by mail, right? I'm wearing a Netflix shirt, and the TSA guy goes, "Do you work at Netflix?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Get out." And he shouts at the guy who's emptying the trash behind me. He's like, "Jose, she works for Netflix." He goes, "Get out." And then he yells at the person back in the day when the Jack in the Box was right in the airport, right? He's like, "This girl works at Netflix." They're all like, "We love it." I called up Reed, right? Because we had cell phones. That's about all. And I'm like, "We made it." The guy at the Jack in the Box knows who we are.
Mine was, I was at Walgreens and this lady saw my Netflix shirt and was like, "I have a broken DVD that I got in the mail." And I was like, yeah, I was like, no. Back to the emotion part, David, like, how should companies think about that compared to popping sales, if you will?
I talk a little bit to some people that are trying to influence a political election. And I tell everybody this. I wrote a book on stories, how you use stories in communication. And what I learned in doing that is that people don't care about your product and your offering and your little innovations. They just don't care. There's media clutter, there's information overload, and there's just people that just want to see the Netflix movie. They don't want to be bothered. Even if you get through, they counter argue. Oh, they're just trying to sell me something. Well, everybody does that. So I think that in communication, I'm trying to make this point to some political advertisers with not much success. It turns out they don't need advice or want advice.
And it shows.
Yeah, it does show.
Yeah, it's a total mess in my opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway, what you really need in an ad that's really going to jump out, there's all kinds of ways to do it, of course, but it really helps if you have a story. And by story, I meant once upon a time, Joe Bro did something and something happened to him and there was tension and so on. And it really helps to have a tagline if it's a good one, or a symbol, a recurring symbol, because without that, it just doesn't get into long-term memory. And if it doesn't have this emotion, it doesn't get attention and it doesn't get processed. And so there's a lot of studies from psychology that demonstrate that point. So if you have a story that's emotional, that's grabbing and so on, if you have a good tagline, if you have a symbol, a recurring symbol of some kind, that they can put this into their memory or adjust it, how it fits, or maybe just reinforce something that's already there. But the next time you have an ad, they don't start over from scratch. They don't have to make that leap themselves. In one of the stories I tell in the book is about Lifebuoy soap, and they've always been in hand washing since they started 110 years ago, but they decided they weren't as effective as they could be. So this was in India, they re-energized in the program. They give it a brand, Help a Child Reach 5. It turns out 2 million kids below the age of 5 die each year. And they put this program involved schools and everything and cartoon characters. They put it in 3 little villages, and they made a video about each of these villages and focusing on a mother that had lost a child or had kept a child safe because of that. You can't watch these 3-minute videos without crying.
Mm.
They were so emotional, so grabbing.
Mm.
And they got 44 million views.
Mm.
Wow.
This is bar soap.
Right.
They got 44 million views.
One of the videos I just watched of you was talking about Hellmann's mayonnaise and about how, like, the purpose of Hellmann's mayonnaise is not to be smooth and creamy, it's to be able to use leftovers.
Yes.
It's the original recycling, repurposing video. But I loved that story that was part of the original. How they sold Hellmann's mayonnaise was that you didn't have to throw away the meatloaf. You could make a sandwich of it. So.
Well, that example didn't have the same kind of emotion that Lifebuoy did,
Yeah.
but what it did have is humor.
Uh-huh.
It was extremely humorous. They had this football player tackling viciously a grandmother that was going to throw away food into a waste paper basket instead of reusing it. And so it was a hilarious ad. And so that got shared. That went viral. And the interesting thing about that is they weren't repositioning their brand. They were just re-energizing it. This message was around 100 years ago when that brand was formed.
Mhm.
It was formed to make sandwiches out of leftovers. That was its message 100 years ago.
Mhm. I love it.
I was thinking internally at the organization, how much does the brand impact the culture and the operating excellence of the organization?
Well, if you look at any really strong organizations that's been strong over time, you almost always see a really strong culture. And it will be driven by a brand. A brand and a culture is intertwined because you have to know what you stand for. What are your values or principles or pillars or whatever you call it? You have to know what you stand for. And if you don't, it's really hard to build a culture.
Mm.
And I think it's no accident that we have these 2-word phrases that's this nonprofit: supporting independence, fostering connection, cultivating healthy aging. And you guys at Netflix had these 2-word phrases, didn't you?
Mhm.
And everybody knew them, didn't
They
they?
did.
They did.
I mean, our biggest one was freedom and responsibility.
But if somebody asked them, what's it like at Netflix and what is your organization, that's going to start the conversation, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's the brand. And I don't know if maybe you in the culture world don't call them brand pillars or brand principles, but that's what they are.
We probably didn't, but it makes a ton of sense. I was thinking as you were talking about 2 big brands that come to mind. One of them is Procter & Gamble. You mentioned that earlier. And Procter & Gamble is such an overall brand now. I mean, it's so many things. To me, it's like, is it baby powder or dish soap or whatever it is? And the other one I was thinking about that is fresher is like Google. And we can't stop calling it Google. It's not the name of the company anymore. And in fact, it's so much more than search, right?
The other thing is Meta. Like I can't call it Meta. I will always call it Facebook.
Well, I blog. I've done 350 blogs. And all of a sudden, I got a blog with 110 viewers. And that was when I challenged the name Meta. I thought that was stupid. And then I got 180,000 views when I commented on X.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do X and let's do Elon. And can a CEO really screw up a brand? Do we have that right in front of us right now?
First, yeah, I think that the renaming of the company to X was really, really dumb.
Because why?
Well, because they had a name that was so powerful,
Mm-hmm.
so familiar, and they just basically walked away from it. And they replaced it with a new name, X, which means nothing.
Mhm.
Maybe X-rated or something.
I know. And remember how stupid we all thought Twitter was?
Yeah.
Like, what a dumb name. A little bird as a symbol. Like, seriously.
But people fell in love with it.
And now there's this loss.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, if it had been SpaceX, I mean, X something,
Yeah.
and they wanted to connect it to SpaceX
Mm-hmm.
and so on, that would have been better, but it would still been a stupid, disastrous thing to do.
Yeah. Do you think he's trying to, I think it's been maybe since he acquired the company, a frustration of his. Do you think he's just trying to dismantle it and make it unsuccessful?
Oh, I don't know about that, but I think that his goal was he had a vision for Twitter. It was going to become the thing that
Ubiquitous.
Does everything.
Yeah.
It does it what Amazon does. It does what Netflix does. It's a one-stop shop.
Mm-hmm.
And they have that in China. And that was his vision. It was very much like Meta. His vision is Metaverse is going to be the future.
Mm-hmm.
So let me call the company Metaverse. Well, like I said in my comment on that, why don't you wait till Metaverse is here and then change the name of your company? And in the meantime, have a Meta program within, say, Facebook. And you can get all the mileage you want out of that thing as a program within the organization. You don't have to change the name of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you change the name of the company, it's a one-time event to announce that you've really made some important changes. In neither case had they done so.
Can
Right.
you think of a company that did that well? Or bigger question, who's really done a beautiful job of creating a long-standing brand that means something to people, that's lasted over time and probably will continue to?
Well, if you think about Apple and Harley Davidson, at both times, those companies were putting out really disappointing products
Mm-hmm.
for a period of years. In the case of Harley, it was, I don't know, 10 years.
Mm.
In the case of Apple, it was at least 5. And at the end of that time, they got a CEO that came in and straightened things up, and the brand was still there. AT&T also, for 10 years, did everything possible to screw up their customer base. But at the end of that time, when they sort of changed things around a bit, the brand was still the strongest brand in the telecommunication space.
Mm.
So, a brand that receives that status, it's got a lot of running room.
Mm.
They can survive, which is really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. If you have a great brand to begin with, and then you go off, the trail for a little bit of time, if you have that foundation, you can establish it back.
Yeah, and so people sometimes buy a heritage brand that's even been out of the market for 10 years, Toys R Us, for example,
Yeah.
and the brand is still there.
Yeah.
Well, what do you see coming up? I mean, oh, wise father of branding, what's going to be significant changes, or what are we in the middle of that's working well or not working?
Well, of course, the AI is changing things, and before that, just the digital world has changed things a lot. But the fundamentals are the same in branding.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to figure out what you stand for. You have to bring them life. You have to give them energy, and on an ongoing basis. And you have to be radically honest. You have to walk the walk.
Mm.
It can't just be words.
Mm-hmm.
When I come back to, how do you survive in this world of media clutter and information overload and so on, I come back to these 3 books I've written. You need to know how to integrate stories into what you're doing. These stories to make the point, or stories to motivate the point, or stories to illustrate the point.
Mm-hmm.
Because they'll remember stories
Mhm.
and they'll listen to stories. And they don't counter argue. I mean, it's just a story. And the second thing, I wrote this book on new subcategories. It's really about how branding is needed in disruptive innovation. Because if you don't have disruptive innovation, then, it's hard to do anything. It's hard to grow.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost impossible to grow without disruptive innovation. And what I feel missing is branding. And so you got to figure out how to position the disruptive innovation, to scale it, and to build barriers. And the third thing is that in order to have a brand that inspires, if you make bar soap, or if you're a bank or insurance company, you need a signature social program. And you need that to give you energy, to give you an image lift, and to give you engagement as well.
Mhm.
I have a story about Barclays Bank, how they recovered from a trust deficit by having some signature programs.
Mm.
Back to AI, because you've mentioned it a few times. How is AI changing things?
Well, AI is kind of like digital. It appears in 20 different forms.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just AI, it's not just something you implement AI.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Tesla is applying AI to building robots, and others are applying AI to summarizing books, or to doing market research more efficiently, or you doing legal research or medical research more efficiently. So it just can appear in so many forms.
Mhm.
And I think that at the end of the day, what's going to happen to AI is that it's not going to be just AI. It's some sort of general purpose program. It's going to be specialized programs. It's going to be AI for medicine, AI for law, AI for saving the environment. And within that, there's going to be specialized applications for AI.
Like the internet, right?
Yeah.
The thing that it was that we couldn't put our fingers on when it first became a thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, and what you've been saying all along is something that really resonates with me because of our time at Netflix, which is about storytelling. And, at Netflix Inside, when we talk to employees about it, we're like, our brand is about bringing great stories to everybody on earth, and that there are great stories all over the earth. Right. And that a Korean movie isn't just for Koreans. Witness the Squid Game. Right. And so for us, that was always a really important part of who we were, was about storytelling. And I think it must be harder. I know it was when I worked in tech that was pure tech. Right. When I worked for Sun Microsystems, my parents would say, now, what do y'all do? I'm like, we make computers. She's like, what kind? I'm like, well, they're big. What do they map the ocean floor? Are they as big as our fridge? Right. This is back when it was, big servers. I'm like, actually, Mom, they are.
Yeah.
But, it was so hard to put emotion around until Sun became the founder of the internet. Right. So it's fascinating with all of this technology as we flipped forward and back to employer branding and employee branding, right? How we all think about that as part of who we are and what we sell to a company and where those things align. So you have also done some stuff recently around purpose. So talk to us about that a little bit.
My take on purpose is that for a lot of firms that don't have energy and they're not that likable, they sell insurance or bar soap, that they really need to look for a higher purpose. And when you do a higher purpose, you can do like Steve Jobs did. They're going to make insanely great products, but it's also helpful to have a social purpose. If somebody has a business purpose that spans the business and social programs, but for most people, they need a social purpose to stand beside the business purpose. And the key to a social purpose, in my view, is that you have to create programs that help the business, that give the business an energy visibility lift, an image lift, and an engagement lift, because that's so hard to do. And so if you look at it that way, what you get is a program that not only is able to access resources of the company, going forward, but they'll thrive because they'll get more than resources. And my favorite example is Dove Real Beauty Program.
Yeah.
I mean, one of their ads became the most viral ad ever done. They got 180 million views. They have changed the life of hundreds of millions of women. And in the meantime, the sales of Dove went from $2.6 billion to $6.5 billion. And it did it on the back of the Real Beauty Program. If people are doing that just to help their business, that's being completely cynical and that's borderline evil. But my retort is, if you are passionate about something, if you make a long-term commitment, Real Beauty has been around for 20 years, not just a fall. If you have that kind of commitment, if you're a thought leader in the area, you're really making contributions and you're part of the community. You're not just using this as a PR device, then nobody accuses Dove of being in it just for profit, even though they are.
Right.
And even though if people stopped and thought about it, of course they're in it for the profit, but it never comes to mind.
No, and when you see those ads, they make you feel good, right? And they make you want to buy their products. But how hard is it for, there's the Doves of the world, but then there's the banks and the insurance companies. How hard is it to find the right purpose? And do often companies find the wrong one?
Well, I was in the board of an insurance company for 10 years, and we spent 10 years searching for the right program. We never did find one.
Oh.
So we were doing grants and all this stuff. We did find 3 programs that worked for small parts of our thing. We just couldn't find a global one. We could never come up with one. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy. That's true. What Barclays, the bank, when they had a real deficit in trust because of their LIBOR problems during the meltdown, they developed a social purpose and then they turned it over to their employees. And 17 of the employees came up with this idea to help people with the digital challenges they were facing, especially elderly, and they formed Digital Eagles. And that 17 people now got 17,000 employees involved in it. And they made some videos on that went viral. And all their efforts to communicate something that would raise their trust failed, but those succeeded.
Wow.
The trust popped up.
So Jessica works mostly with startups now. So Jessica, how important is brand early on? Do people talk about it early on still, or do they wait until they've got the real thing? Or
I think it depends, how much effort they're putting around it. But I think what I'm learning from David in this conversation is not to use all the labels, right? But the pillars or the principles or the values in which you stand for, that your brand really does start building from the day you start your company, right? And I think you have to know what you stand for, and you have to know how that impacts the decisions that you're going to make around your strategy, your customers, your business, and your people. And as we, learned at Netflix, as we grew and we learned more, our values evolved. The foundation, the fundamentals didn't change, but the way we approached them evolved. And I think that that's what's happening in startups. And you know this, Patty, some of them don't know exactly who they are yet because they're like making it up as they go along.
Right.
But I think the founders that have a very strong vision and operate from principles, I think, their brand starts to
There's a seed
be
there.
something. There's a seed. Yeah.
Wow. What do you think, David? Is she right?
Well, one story is that of Salesforce. They started 1999 with 3 people in an apartment, and they started with the idea that we're going to do this 1-1-1 business. We're going to give 1% of the employees' time, 1% of our profits, and 1% of our product to do social good. And something like, 15 years later, they decided we'd open it up and challenge other companies to do the same thing we're doing, this 1-1-1 program. 10,000 companies are now doing it.
Wow.
But that started in the day one. That was started in their early days.
I mean, which is quite amazing because it's like, how do you know to do that when you're just 3 people in an apartment somewhere?
Well, the founder had gone to India and studied under a guru who inspired him.
And they have the whole Hawaiian deep values around who they are as people in a company and how they treat each other. I'm not sure it scales, but I mean, they certainly paid attention to it. I mean, I guess that's sort of one of the real lessons here. Like, if you just wait for it to happen organically, it's gonna, but it may not turn out the way you want it to. If you don't put thought into it, and like you said, programs and discipline.
When entrepreneurs, if they're inside a company or outside, when they're staffing up, they cut a lot on their plate. They got to raise money. They got to get the beta stage out. And the people that they need to do that are the priority. And branding is just not a priority. And a lot of them don't know that, and they don't have access to the people that do. And so there's that.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to leave our listeners with, David, in terms of thinking about the world or thinking about their company? Any sage words of wisdom?
I think it comes back to the fundamentals, to take the time to figure out what you do stand for. And then even more important is to make sure that they drive things you do, so that they're just not a slogan on the wall, but they're something that influences. And so when you're developing your brand pillars, you need to think, is this really something that is going to influence what we do and how we behave? And if it isn't, then what I have in my world, what I call extended pillars or extended vision. And that means you might have 3 or 4 things that are important, but everybody expects you to do them, and they still need to get done, but they're not something you're going to talk about when you talk about us and how we're different and how we're special.
Right.
Totally hear you.
One more thing, I think the biggest low-hanging fruit is just to brand things. And all these entrepreneurs will have this secret sauce. They'll have something that's really special, and they don't brand it.
Mm.
I mean, if you can brand radical honesty and radical hospitality, you can brand anything.
True.
Where can we find you, David?
Well, my blog is on davidaaker.com. And I have the book that summarizes my other books is called Aaker on Branding. It's now being revised, and the new version will be out early next year.
Awesome.
And my latest book is The Pursuit of Purpose-Driven Branding, and it's about how you should develop a signature social program that will not only impact socially, but it also elevate your relevance, your image, and your engagement.
Well, I have so enjoyed talking to you, and I learned so much in this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward and Mick Finnegan. Thank you, Kathleen Speckert, and the whole Edit Audio team.